Welcome, dear listener. As you settle into your bed or nestle into your favorite blanket, allow your mind to drift gently away from the present moment. Let the rhythm of your breath begin to slow, syncing with the calm cadence of the past. Tonight, we'll journey together into a time before central heating, before electric blankets, thermal wear, or the comforting fluff of modern fabrics. A time when the winters were long, cold, and unforgiving, and the layers between the human body and the icy air were few. You might be wrapped in soft cotton or cozy fleece now. But imagine yourself centuries ago, in a stone-built cottage or a wooden hall, firelight flickering dimly on the walls, wind creeping through every crack. There is no insulation, no thermostat to turn. And what lies closest to your skin? Likely not underwear as we know it today. In this 2-hour journey, we'll explore the surprisingly ingenious, and sometimes astonishingly sparse, methods people used to stay warm in winters past, without what we now consider the most basic of garments. From medieval peasants in northern Europe to nomads across the Eurasian steppe, from the Roman frontier to the isolated villages of the Alps, we'll dive into the lives they lived, the textiles they trusted, and the cultural norms that shaped what was worn, and what was not. We'll begin by immersing ourselves in daily life, what it truly felt like to wake up in a freezing house with nothing but wool, linen, or fur to buffer the elements. Then, we'll shift into stories of individuals and events, figures who endured icebound marches, brutal winters, or even frost-covered battles. After that, we'll explore archaeological finds and cultural curiosities that reveal what lay hidden beneath outer garments, or didn't. And finally, we'll journey upward into castles, courts, and monasteries, where warmth was both a luxury and a statement of class. So lie back, breathe deeply, and prepare to step into the slow, layered, and surprisingly revealing world of historical winters. This is a quiet story not of survival against the odds, but of enduring cold as a daily rhythm, one woven into the very fabric of existence. Let's begin. Imagine yourself waking just before dawn in a small, timber-framed cottage on the edge of a forest. It is the year 1372. Outside, the land is blanketed in snow, thick, powdery, undisturbed by footprints. The air inside your home is no warmer than it is outside. The hearth's embers are grey and cold. There is no glass on the windows, only shutters or oiled cloth. Your breath fogs as you exhale. You are wrapped in a coarse wool blanket. Underneath, you sleep in a long linen tunic, your only garment. Beneath that? Nothing. In much of pre-modern Europe, underwear, particularly for the lower classes, was a luxury, not a standard. Linen, the fabric most commonly used for undergarments, was expensive to produce and required regular washing to stay hygienic. For many, it simply wasn't practical to own more than 1 or 2 linen items. Instead, outer layers did the bulk of the work, and the body was left largely unadorned beneath. Now, picture your day beginning. The first task is to stir the hearth to life. You kneel beside the ashes, still in your long tunic, cold against your thighs. There is no rush. The day's rhythm is slow. Once the fire begins to crackle, you warm your hands and perhaps place a stone near the flame, something you can wrap in cloth and tuck close to your chest or lap later, a makeshift hot water bottle. Then comes the task of dressing. Your outer garment is a heavier woolen overtunic, itchy by modern standards but essential for warmth. There are no underpants to tug on, no socks. Instead, you might wrap strips of woolen cloth around your feet and calves. Known in some regions as puttees or leg bindings. These provide insulation, yes, but also serve as protection against rough terrain or frostbite. The layers you wear are not fashionable. They are survival. A woolen hood or coif, a second tunic if you are fortunate, and perhaps even a rough cloak made from sheepskin or thickly felted wool complete the ensemble. The scent of lanolin, a natural, waxy substance found in wool, lingers around you. It repels water and adds insulation. In a way, it replaces the warmth that modern synthetic fabrics provide. There is something strangely comforting about the simplicity. Your neighbors are dressed much the same. Modesty, as understood today, is different. There's no shame in sharing sleeping spaces or being seen in just your tunic. The communal effort to stay warm fosters a kind of quiet intimacy among families. As the day progresses, your body keeps warm through movement. You gather firewood, mend tools, tend animals, and sweep snow from the doorstep. Activity replaces insulation. And when the wind bites hard, you pull your hood closer and press on. There is no choice. In the evenings, warmth is shared. People huddle near the fire, sometimes pressed shoulder to shoulder. Children nestle close to their parents. Hot stones wrapped in cloth may be passed around, and ale or weak wine helps dull the edge of the cold. Bedding is shared too, not just for love, but for warmth. This is the rhythm of winter for many centuries. A world without thermal underwear, fleece pajamas, or socks knit from acrylic yarn. A world where cold was a companion, not a condition to be eliminated, but something to be managed, endured, and accepted. Even among the upper classes, underwear was often absent, though for different reasons. Garments were heavy and layered, and those closest to the skin were sometimes omitted altogether in favor of long chemises or linen shifts, changed infrequently due to the labor required to wash them. Throughout much of history, especially in colder climates, people developed techniques not to eliminate cold, but to move with it. Cloaks became windbreakers. Straw-stuffed bedding insulated sleeping bodies. Sleeping in shared piles, among family or fellow travelers, was not unusual, even expected. In the absence of our modern comforts, survival depended not just on clothing, but on habits, on moving with the daylight, on keeping busy, on sleeping close. The idea of shivering through a night alone in one's underwear would have seemed absurd. Far better to forego such luxuries altogether than to strip away what little heat your body could hold. As the fire dims again, and the wind moans through the trees, imagine yourself once more lying beneath your woolen blanket. The air is still cold, but your body has adapted. Your skin, roughened by wind and time, no longer recoils from the chill. There is no thermostat to nudge upward. Only breath, shared warmth, and the steady rhythm of ancient winters. And so, in that small, snow-draped home, you drift into sleep, wrapped not in underwear, but in centuries of quiet resilience. Imagine, if you will, the clinking of metal, the soft crunch of snow under thousands of sandals, and the breath of soldiers suspended in the frigid morning air. We are no longer in a quiet medieval village, but marching across the wintry lands of northern Europe during the 1st century CE, deep in the territory the Romans called Germania. The Roman army was vast, organized, and famed for its discipline. Its soldiers, or legionaries, were not pampered with comfort. They moved with efficiency and precision, often under severe conditions. One of the greatest misconceptions modern minds hold is that Roman soldiers were always clad in brilliant armor and thick cloaks. But when marching across snowy frontiers, their attire was far less glamorous, and far more vulnerable to the cold. The standard undergarment for a Roman soldier was a simple tunic, usually made from wool. And beneath that? Nothing. No briefs. No thermal leggings. No socks. Sandals, open-toed and with thin soles, were the daily footwear of choice, even in snow and ice. You might wonder, how did they manage? The answer lies not only in the garments, but in the culture and expectations of the time. The body was seen not as something to be coddled, but hardened. Soldiers trained nearly every day, even in winter. Their bodies were lean, muscular, and conditioned to extremes. Comfort was not a concept given much weight in the Roman military system. Instead, the ability to withstand hardship was considered a virtue. There are records, faint, scattered, but persistent, that suggest soldiers may have sometimes adapted their gear for colder climates. In particularly frigid regions, Roman commanders allowed or even encouraged additions: fur-lined cloaks, long-sleeved tunics, leg wrappings called fasciae, and in rare cases, closed shoes. But under it all, they still lacked the private comfort of any underlayer beneath their tunics. The chill of the morning would bite directly at the thighs and knees. Sandals might be stuffed with wool or layered with wrapped cloth, but they offered little insulation. One of the most striking examples comes from the campaigns of Germanicus, adopted son of the Emperor Tiberius. In the year 15 CE, Germanicus led his troops deep into the snowy forests beyond the Rhine. The air was bitter. The trees stood stiff with frost. These soldiers had no sleeping bags or thick sleeping robes. They dug trenches, built fires, and huddled together for warmth, often 2 or 3 to a cloak. There was no shame in sharing body heat. It was survival. Imagine lying there, on frozen earth, wrapped in your woolen cloak, with only the fabric of your tunic separating your skin from the air. There is snow on your beard. Your thighs ache with cold. Your legs are exposed each time you shift. But you are trained to endure. You know the dawn will bring more marching, more forest, more cold. And still, you sleep, perhaps even dream. When snow grew deep or temperatures dropped below freezing, Roman engineers would construct small stone or timber shelters, with braziers for warmth. But such luxuries were rare. For most soldiers, the cold was simply endured. And yet, for all its harshness, this lifestyle became familiar. There was rhythm, even ritual, to preparing for a winter march. Soldiers learned to sleep near embers without setting their cloaks alight. They learned to move their limbs constantly, to stamp their feet and flex their toes to keep the blood moving. They knew to eat hot barley porridge before sleeping and drink warm wine spiced with honey when they could. As for hygiene, it too reflected the hardships of the cold. Washing oneself in icy rivers during campaign was rare, even dangerous. Tunics, when soiled, were beaten clean with sticks or brushed out over fires, rather than washed with water. The cold itself, it was believed, preserved the body. When we consider underwear today, we think of comfort, privacy, and hygiene. But for these soldiers, and countless others across history, such garments were unknown or impractical. Layers slowed movement. Cloth was precious. Warmth came not from undergarments, but from activity, from shared heat, and from stoic endurance. Perhaps, on some winter evening, after a day of trudging through snow, a legionary would sit near a fire, his knees bare beneath his tunic, steam rising from his wet sandals. And perhaps he would think of home. Of the sun-warmed streets of Rome, of olive groves, of long, lazy baths. But he would not dwell. For tomorrow, there would be frost again. And his tunic, scratchy and plain, would once more be his only armor against the cold beneath. This tale, though quiet and simple, speaks of a broader truth: people of the past did not await warmth. They did not expect ease. They moved forward through winter wrapped not in layers, but in resilience, in familiarity, and in rhythm. A rhythm that whispered not of comfort, but of continuation. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of shovels brushing against compacted soil. The gentle brushing of a soft bristle against fragments of fabric. In the quiet world of archaeology, winter garments are among the most elusive finds. Unlike pottery or metal tools, textiles rarely survive the centuries, especially undergarments, which were often made of organic, perishable materials like linen or wool. And yet, in peat bogs, frozen burials, and sealed tombs, whispers of ancient winters have been preserved. In these rare places, time slows, and sometimes stops altogether. It's in these frozen or waterlogged environments that the mystery deepens, and the absence of underwear becomes not just a cultural quirk, but a deliberate, practical reality. Let's start in the cold, peaty wetlands of Denmark. The famed Toland man, discovered in 1950, was a remarkably preserved Iron Age individual. He was buried in a bog sometime around 400 BCE. His face still bore a peaceful expression. His body still wore a pointed leather cap, a belt, and a noose, grim reminders of ritual practices. But notably, he wore no pants and no undergarments at all. This absence wasn't uncommon. Other bog bodies, like the Grauble man or the Elling woman, reveal the same thing. People either wore a simple outer garment, like a woolen tunic or animal skin cloak, or were completely nude at burial. But the question arises: were they stripped for ritual, or was underwear simply absent from their lives? Archaeologists have debated this, but evidence suggests that, for many ancient northern European cultures, undergarments as we define them today simply didn't exist. Clothing was functional, minimal, and layered only as needed. Outerwear often served dual purposes, both modesty and insulation. Layers next to the skin weren't always preferred. Sweat, lice, and filth were easier to deal with when confined to a single heavy woolen tunic than spread across multiple thin garments that were harder to clean. Moving east, we find similar hints. In the icy grave sites of the Paseric culture, nomads of the Altai Mountains, archaeologists have uncovered full outfits buried in the permafrost, preserved for over 2,000 years. These include fur-lined coats, elaborately patterned woolen trousers, and tall leather boots. But again, nothing resembling underwear. Instead, they relied on combinations of skins, felted wool, and sometimes padded trousers, worn directly over bare skin. These trousers, though thick, did not include a separate underlayer. Some even had decorative seams and fur on the inside, indicating that warmth was prioritized, but undergarments were not needed to achieve it. In desert cultures, where nights can be bitterly cold despite hot days, the story is the same. Ancient Egyptian linen kilts, or the simple wrap garments worn by workers and laborers, provided little insulation. During colder months, particularly during the flood season, workers were issued thicker outer wraps or animal skin cloaks. But again, undergarments were rarely depicted, and almost never preserved. One of the challenges in deciphering these historical habits is the silence of the evidence. Underwear, being intimate and often considered trivial by chroniclers, was rarely recorded in written accounts. It was seen as a private matter, not worthy of mention. In many cultures, it simply wasn't separate from the tunic or chemise. The first layer worn against the skin was also the only layer for many. Even in medieval Europe, where washing linen shifts became a part of monastic routines or noble hygiene, we find a curious divide. Wealthier individuals sometimes owned long linen chemises or drawers, but these were not always worn daily, especially not among the working class. In peasant burials, remains of woolen outer layers are sometimes found. Linen, being less durable and biodegradable, has almost always vanished. But from indirect clues, we learn that most people slept in their daily tunic, woke in it, and worked in it, with nothing between it and their skin. And then there are the cultural records, not archaeological finds, but stories, laws, and images. Illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages, for instance, often depict peasants lifting their tunics to urinate or defecate, revealing bare legs and hips underneath. There's no indication of modesty being violated. It's simply how things were. Sumptuary laws, the rules governing who could wear what, also help paint the picture. In late medieval England, laws restricted certain classes from wearing silk or fur-lined undergarments. These restrictions would have had little impact on most people, because few owned any such layers. But their mention tells us that underlayers were more about wealth than necessity. The cold was faced communally, without the insulation of fabric, but with the acceptance of shared discomfort. We also find poetic records, like Icelandic sagas, where warriors and farmers describe pulling on heavy cloaks against the biting wind, or wrapping their feet in moss and wool. But once more, no mention of underwear. What archaeology and cultural record both show us is that underwear, as a concept, was shaped by more than comfort. It was shaped by climate, culture, access to materials, and the rhythm of daily life. It was something that evolved slowly, and often didn't evolve at all for those whose priorities were purely practical. So the mystery becomes not why they didn't wear it, but why we do. Over centuries, notions of hygiene, modesty, and personal space transformed what people wore closest to their skin. But for much of history, especially in the chill of winter, warmth didn't begin with underwear. It began with shared beds, thick cloaks, and the rhythm of movement. It began with the acceptance of cold, not its elimination. Imagine now, an archaeologist centuries from today uncovering our modern clothes. Would they marvel at how many layers we wear? How many kinds of fabric? Would they wonder at our insistence on separating garments into under and over? Or would they understand that every age creates its own idea of what lies closest to the body? The earth, when it yields its ancient fabrics, does so quietly. And what it tells us is not that people were cold and uncomfortable, but that they lived differently. That comfort was redefined with every breath of winter wind, every wool-wrapped foot, and every long, cold night spent beneath thick blankets, with nothing at all beneath. Picture yourself now inside a stone castle in the English countryside during the 14th century. It's early winter, and the sun is setting behind distant hills. The castle walls are thick and heavy, made of grey stone quarried from nearby cliffs. They hold heat poorly. There is a fire crackling in the great hall, but the warmth barely reaches beyond its circle of light. The corridors and chambers are cold, echoing chambers where breath still clouds in the air. This is a place of privilege. The woman seated by the fire wears a gown of finely dyed wool, perhaps layered with a surcoat trimmed in fur. Her sleeves are long and trailing, and the hem of her dress brushes against rush-covered floors. Her hair is braided with care, and the laces of her bodice are drawn tight. Yet beneath it all, beneath the fine fabrics, the jewelry, the embroidery, there is, again, no underwear. Noble women of the Middle Ages and Renaissance typically wore a linen chemise or shift closest to the skin. This was a long, loose garment with long sleeves, reaching to the ankles or knees. But it was not underwear in the modern sense. It functioned more like a combination nightgown, undershirt, and laundry buffer. It was designed to absorb sweat and body oils, to protect the costlier outer garments from being soiled. But beneath the chemise, the body remained unadorned. Even noblemen wore something similar, a long linen shirt under a tunic or doublet. Beneath that? Not briefs. Not boxers. And certainly not thermal long johns. Instead, the chemise or shirt was tucked in, and if the man wore hose, tight-fitting leg coverings often joined with a codpiece, it was those hose that provided both coverage and warmth. But they were not worn over undergarments. The skin beneath them was bare. As we explore life inside these great halls, we begin to understand a fascinating contradiction. The elite had access to fabrics and tailoring, to fur linings and custom-fit garments. They could afford laundresses, warm fires, and feather-filled bedding. But even so, they lived in spaces where heat was precious and fleeting. Their castles were cold. Their rooms often unheated, their bathrooms non-existent, and their clothing dictated as much by fashion as by practicality. Let's imagine a typical morning for a noblewoman during the winter months. She wakes on a curtained bed, piled with woolen blankets and maybe fur throws. She slept in her chemise. A servant brings warm water, not for a full bath, but for wiping down the hands, face, and feet. Full body bathing was rare in the cold season. It risked chills, illness, and discomfort. As she dresses, the chemise remains. Over it goes a kirtle, a snug-fitting dress of wool or heavy linen. Then a surcoat, or outer robe, which might be trimmed with squirrel or miniver fur. If she must venture outdoors, she adds a cloak, often fastened with a jeweled clasp at the throat. But between her skin and all this finery? Still only the chemise. No drawers, no stockings in the modern sense, no insulation beneath the waist beyond the flowing layers. The cold air, even in these high places, was a constant companion. It is likely that many noble women and men felt its bite each time they stood still too long or let a sleeve slip too far. Warmth came not from underlayers, but from smart use of outer garments, from fur linings and layered cloaks. In bed, the lack of underwear was considered natural. There were no pajamas. Instead, one either slept in the same linen chemise or, in many cases, naked. Beds were warmed with stone or iron warmers, sometimes filled with coals and swaddled in cloth. These were placed under the covers before bedtime, removed when the bed had heated. Sometimes, dogs or cats were allowed to curl beneath the sheets as additional living heat sources. And for the nobility, modesty took a different form. Privacy was minimal, yet the exposure of the body was not taboo in the same way it would become in later centuries. Servants dressed and undressed their lords and ladies. Midwives, chambermaids, and stewards regularly saw their employers in partial or full nudity. The body, unclothed and uninsulated, was simply part of the daily rhythm, another layer of life, neither hidden nor dramatized. Even among royalty, underwear was not guaranteed. Queen Elizabeth I of England, known for her elaborate gowns and regal image, likely wore layers upon layers of silks, linens, and stiffened fabrics, but no underwear in the modern sense. Her underclothing was a linen chemise and sometimes a fardingale to support her skirts, but no knickers, no drawers. They did not yet exist in the female wardrobe. When drawers did begin to appear in the noble classes, it was among men, first in Italy, then gradually across Europe. But they were more fashion than function, and often tight and cumbersome. It wasn't until the 17th century that women in some regions adopted drawers, and even then, they were mostly for horseback riding or specific climates. In many cases, drawers were seen as unladylike or associated with theatrical performers and prostitutes. In elite life, then, cold was simply part of the architecture. Castles echoed with it. Marble halls kept it in. The clothing draped over bodies did little to trap warmth beneath, but plenty to display status. And yet, warmth was found in other places, in mulled wine sipped by the hearth, in great feasts shared in long halls, in featherbeds passed down through generations. And sometimes, in quiet moments between duty and display, the nobility warmed themselves simply by wrapping their cloaks tighter and pulling the sleeves of their gowns over their hands. There is a certain poetry in this lifestyle. It was layered and grand, full of ceremony and structure. Yet beneath the robes and rings, beneath the velvets and furs, the body remained as exposed as that of any peasant, bare against the cold, pressed against the linens of winter. So the next time you visit a castle or see a painting of a noble in winter dress, remember, beneath all the opulence, the bodies were closer to the chill than we might imagine. No matter how grand the hall or fine the fabric, the cold touched all, rich and poor alike, slipping past embroidery, silk, and lace, down to the skin. Imagine now that you are waking up in a wooden cabin, nestled deep in the forested interior of 16th century northern Russia. The windows are frosted over with ice, the light from the low winter sun filters in dimly through animal skin panes. You are not royalty, nor are you a peasant in a Western European village. You are a villager in the far north, perhaps a hunter or the wife of a furrier. Outside, snow is piled in thick drifts. It creaks underfoot. The air is painfully cold. Inside, your world smells of smoke, pine resin, and wet wool drying near the fire. The fire never truly dies out here. In regions where the cold could kill in mere hours, warmth was survival, not comfort. But the idea of underwear, as a separate, intimate layer against the skin, remained absent or minimal for centuries, even here. Instead, warmth came from smarter solutions: dense wool tunics, soft felted boots, reindeer hides, and layers that were shared, not stacked. You wake under heavy blankets filled with moss or straw. Your night clothes? If you are fortunate, you sleep in a long linen or hempen shirt. But beneath it, nothing else. If your shirt is thick enough, it may carry the smell of the last fire or of sweat from the day's work. It is not changed daily. It is beaten, brushed, perhaps snow-washed, but rarely immersed in water during winter. In Russia, and especially among the rural population, warmth was achieved through the oven, the pechka, a giant masonry stove that doubled as a bed platform. Entire families slept near or on it, using body heat and the radiant warmth of the stove to survive the nights. Undergarments weren't necessary when you were wrapped in fur robes or pressed close to loved ones. When it came time to rise, you would dress in multiple layers, but not the way modern people do. A long shirt or tunic served as your base layer. Then came the kaftan, a woolen robe, often quilted or felted for warmth. On top of that, you might add a padded vest, and finally a coat, perhaps fur-lined, perhaps not. But beneath it all, still no structured underwear. The body was insulated by the quality of the outerwear, not by piling on many thin garments beneath. The idea of drawers or trousers worn under the tunic was unfamiliar to most women, and limited even among men. Men might wear long woolen trousers, or portki, which were sometimes tied with strings at the waist and ankles. But again, these were more like over-trousers than true underclothing. They were meant to be practical, sometimes layered over wrappings, but not paired with anything beneath. Footwear was unique in its warmth. The valenki, or felted wool boots, have existed in Russia for centuries. Made by compressing sheep's wool into dense, warm material, these boots could keep feet warm even in deep snow. They were often worn with no socks at all, or with simple foot cloths, which were strips of linen or wool wrapped around the feet. These cloths could be dried easily, replaced cheaply, and adjusted for fit. Further north, among the Sami people of Lapland, who herded reindeer and lived in tents called lavu, the clothing was adapted even more intricately to winter life. Garments were made from tanned reindeer hides, worn with the fur side in. These clothes fit loosely, trapping warm air inside and allowing moisture to escape. But again, nothing was worn underneath them except perhaps a simple shirt or tunic. The idea was to allow the natural properties of the fur to regulate the body's warmth. Adding cotton or linen underneath would trap sweat and reduce efficiency. The Sami also wrapped their feet in dried grass, moss, or fur, inserted into soft leather boots. These materials absorbed moisture and could be replaced daily. In such a system, underwear would have been not only unnecessary, but problematic. It would interfere with the breathable insulation the entire outfit was designed to achieve. In these regions, winter was not a season, it was the dominant force of life. It shaped architecture, food, belief, and of course, clothing. Houses were low and tightly sealed. People lived communally. Warmth came from proximity, not privacy. And the body, rather than being encased in layers of fine cloth, was protected by experience, tradition, and the ingenious use of natural materials. Modesty was shaped by different values. In harsh winter climates, practicality always overrode appearance. Families shared sleeping quarters. Children, elders, travelers, all huddled together. When clothing was removed, it was for necessity, not ceremony. There was little space or time for private dressing rituals. Instead, garments were put on and taken off quickly, efficiently, with no time spent fussing over what lay closest to the skin. Bathing followed seasonal rhythms. In the summer, river bathing was possible. In winter, it became dangerous. But in Russia, the banya, a steam bath, provided a solution. Once or twice a week, families would strip down and sweat out the dirt and cold in these wooden saunas, emerging pink and clean before dressing again in their heavy, insulating clothing. Even so, after the steam bath, there was still no rush to put on underpants. The warmth of the banya was sealed in with thick tunics and robes. The inner layers remained simple, minimal, and familiar. There is a kind of purity in these northern customs. They are stripped of pretense. No layers of decorative modesty, no pretensions of fashion beneath the surface. Instead, life was lived honestly, shaped by the rhythms of survival, by the materials at hand, and by the knowledge passed from one generation to the next. So as you imagine yourself walking across a snow-covered path, the cold air stinging your cheeks, your feet warm in felted boots, your arms wrapped in fur-trimmed sleeves, know that beneath it all, there is still a simplicity. No elastic waistbands. No hidden linings. Just skin, wool, and wind. And the steady heartbeat of life lived in sync with the season. The streets are cobbled and narrow, winding through Florence, Paris, or London. Church bells toll across rooftops of terracotta and slate. Merchants open their shutters. A boy scatters sawdust outside a butcher's stall to soak the blood of the morning's work. You, our imagined traveler, step carefully over the edge of a broken step, your shoes smooth-soled and thin. It's the 17th century now, and you are layered in color, fabric, and new social expectations. This was a world where outerwear made the statement, and innerwear remained humble, or absent. But for the first time, whispers of what lay beneath the visible became part of social identity. Not because of hygiene or comfort, but because of changing ideas of class, virtue, and visibility. At first glance, the period might appear to offer more sophisticated clothing, with elaborate ruffs, voluminous skirts, powdered wigs, and jewel-trimmed waistcoats. Yet, if you were to peel back each shimmering layer of silk and brocade, you'd still find a surprising truth: for most people, underclothes remained minimal. And for many, still non-existent. For men, the linen shirt continued to be the single most common undergarment. It served as nightwear, daywear, sweat-catcher, and symbol of respectability. A gentleman might wear a fresh one daily, laundered, whitened, starched. But a laborer? He would wear it for days or weeks, washing it only when the smell became unbearable or a feast day demanded fresh linen. The linen shirt was often worn beneath a doublet, tight-fitting and padded, and then under a jerkin or coat. Trousers evolved into breeches, tied or buttoned at the knee. But what lay beneath the breeches? Rarely anything. Men generally did not wear underpants as we know them. A codpiece might have added volume or protection, but not modesty. Even noblemen, clad in embroidered waistcoats and velvet cloaks, often had nothing between skin and breeches beyond their shirt tails tucked between their legs. Women, meanwhile, lived under gowns that could span the width of doorways. Their underwear consisted almost entirely of the shift, a long, loose-fitting linen gown worn under everything else. Like the man's shirt, it caught sweat, oil, and odor. Corsets were layered over the shift, shaping the torso into the desired silhouette. Skirts, petticoats, and hoops followed. But underpants? Still absent. Even royalty went without them. Queen Elizabeth I wore layers of silk, whalebone corsetry, and embroidered shifts, but she had no structured undergarment akin to panties. She was sewn into her clothes daily by handmaidens, everything built over the linen chemise. The intimate zone remained unshaped, uncovered, untouched by cloth. Why? For one, laundry was grueling. Soap was caustic. Water was dangerous in winter. Fabrics wore out quickly. Underwear would have added more to wash, more to replace, and more to dry in damp conditions. The shift, by contrast, could be scrubbed and boiled. It was simpler. Modesty was expressed differently than today. One's virtue was not located in what was hidden under the skirts or breeches, but in the demeanor, in how one stood, walked, bowed. The underlayers were less about concealment and more about practicality. Yet this period also birthed contradictions. In art and literature, the nude body began to return, not in shame, but in celebration. Michelangelo's sculptures exposed musculature with divine reverence. In salons and theaters, flirtation and fashion danced hand in hand. People began to care what was imagined beneath the gown or breeches. But the garments themselves remained unchanged. By the 18th century, Enlightenment ideals brought greater interest in cleanliness, anatomy, and public health. Parisian thinkers began to associate odor with disease, and clothing with morality. Yet the first solution was not to add underwear, but to wash the linen more frequently. The shirt and shift, still the first barrier between skin and outerwear, took the brunt of hygiene expectations. They were scrubbed, bleached in the sun, and often repaired until the fabric turned to lace from wear. Interestingly, we do see some exceptions by the late 1700s. Among elite women, especially in France, short drawers began to appear, not for modesty, but to preserve warmth and protect silk gowns from body oils. These were often open-crotched, loose, and tied at the waist. But even then, they were the exception, not the rule. Most women went without them. And even those who wore them might remove them in summer, or during pregnancy, or because the fastenings proved inconvenient. One observer in the 18th century commented with surprise that women wore no underpantaloons, noting that the shift was the only true garment of intimacy. In contrast, the idea of clean linen became a moral signal. A visible collar or cuff, crisp and white, marked you as orderly and virtuous, even if your legs were bare beneath your skirts. For the lower classes, little changed. Farmers, maids, chimney sweeps, milk sellers, and smiths lived by necessity. Clothing was mended, patched, and often shared. Underwear was a luxury, often unnecessary, and in some cases, entirely unknown. A child might grow to adolescence without ever owning more than 2 shirts. A woman might marry and bear children with nothing under her gown but a cotton shift worn thin as paper. In cold months, warmth came from layering skirts, adding cloaks, or wrapping feet in rags. The body was resilient. Life was demanding. And the idea of layering beneath everything else remained foreign to all but a few. As we drift through this period, we see a strange paradox. The body was more visible in art than it had been for centuries, yet more private in life. Clothing became structured, formal, elaborate, yet the skin beneath was still touched only by the simplest linen. The illusion of complexity floating over the barest reality. So as you picture yourself walking through a foggy London morning, wrapped in woolen cloaks, petticoats rustling around your ankles, or perhaps striding through a French salon, perfume heavy in the air, remember what lies beneath. A simple shirt. A thin chemise. Nothing more. The underworld of fashion had yet to arrive. But the conditions were forming. And in the next century, everything would begin to shift. The 1800s arrive not with a whisper, but with the clank of machines. Coal smoke winds its way through the narrow streets of Birmingham and Manchester, thick as fog, hanging in the air like a wet coat. This was an age of invention, of discomfort wrapped in progress. And, crucially for our story, it was also the age when the bare lower halves of Europe and America began, finally, to be covered. Why now? What changed? Let's begin with a series of simple but revolutionary events. Cotton became cheap. Fabric became abundant. Laundry services expanded. And factories started producing clothing on a scale previously unimaginable. For the first time in history, the working class could afford extra garments, more than just a shirt and trousers or a shift and gown. They could own spares. They could change clothes. And, for some, they could own dedicated underwear. The very idea of underwear began to solidify during this period. But it didn't arrive all at once. Instead, it emerged slowly, unevenly, across classes and genders, often shaped by practicality more than modesty. Let's start with men. In the early 1800s, many men still wore only a shirt tucked between their legs under breeches or trousers. But over time, a new garment appeared: long drawers. These were loose-fitting, ankle-length cotton underpants that tied at the waist. They were intended not only to protect the outer garments from sweat, but also to provide warmth in the cold, damp climate of British cities. For laborers, they were a revelation, something that made long shifts in unheated warehouses more bearable. These drawers were still considered optional, however. Some men wore them daily, others only during winter or illness. But by the middle of the century, factory workers, soldiers, and schoolboys were regularly issued or expected to wear them. The spread of public health ideas played a role, too. Doctors and hygiene reformers encouraged people to change underclothes regularly, if only to avoid lice and skin diseases. Interestingly, the design of these underpants was not very modest. Many were open-crotched or featured flaps and buttons for convenience. Comfort and practicality came first. The idea of underwear as an object of decency or privacy was still forming. Meanwhile, women experienced a subtler shift. For centuries, they had worn only a shift beneath layers of skirts and petticoats. But as skirt sizes ballooned to absurd widths in the mid-19th century, thanks to hoops and crinolines, some women began wearing drawers as well. These were often open between the legs and tied at the waist with a drawstring. Their main function was not modesty but warmth and to prevent thighs from chafing as a woman maneuvered through her daily life under several feet of cloth. In fact, the idea of women wearing pants of any kind was controversial. In France and England, the first drawers worn by women were considered scandalous, associated with actresses, dancers, or the extremely fashionable. Even Queen Victoria's court was slow to adopt them. For much of the 19th century, a respectable woman might own one or two pairs, worn during menstruation, cold weather, or while traveling, but they were still far from universal. What made them more common was, again, practicality. As middle-class women moved into urban apartments, rode trains, walked city streets, and began engaging with public life in new ways, they needed new garments to match. Petticoats alone wouldn't do. Undergarments evolved. And of course, by the late 1800s, we see the rise of corsets, tight, shaped bodices laced over chemises. Corsets often did the work of shaping the body, offering posture and support, and effectively serving the function of a bra. But beneath them, cotton drawers, now shorter, often knee-length, began to settle into women's wardrobes. Still, for the rural poor and urban underclass, underwear remained a privilege. A washerwoman in Dublin or a coal miner's wife in Leeds might still wear just a worn chemise beneath her work dress. One pair of drawers, patched and threadbare, might last a year. Many simply did without. Laundry was still done by hand, and even in 1890, a young factory girl might wash her shift weekly but her drawers monthly, if she had them. Let's not forget the children. Boys and girls were often dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing, and that included underlayers. Drawers were more common for children by the mid-century, especially in boarding schools, where hygiene became a public health concern. But again, much depended on class. Wealthy children had linen-lined wardrobes, poor ones might sleep and work in the same shift until it fell apart. As the century drew to a close, several cultural forces pushed underwear further into daily life. Hygiene reformers began linking disease prevention with daily washing and clean undergarments. Mass-produced soap and washing machines, rudimentary but improving, made regular laundry more possible. Postal catalogs like Sears in the US or Whiteley's in Britain offered cheap underwear to far-flung customers. Underwear became fashionable. Ads emerged praising the delicacy and modesty of soft underdrawers, even romanticizing them as a marker of refinement. Thus, we arrive at a curious moment in history, perhaps around 1895, when the average man in London, Chicago, or Berlin likely wore long cotton underdrawers. A woman wore short split drawers under her corset and petticoats. And children finally had a chance at fresh underwear at least once a week. The idea of being fully dressed now included underwear. It had become part of the daily ritual. Its absence was, increasingly, associated with poverty, eccentricity, or indecency. Still, these undergarments were a far cry from what we know today. They were bulky, awkward, fastened with ties or buttons. They were not yet discreet, stretchy, or even private. But they existed. At last, the body had begun to receive its base layer. The world of exposed thighs, bare chafing, and one-shift living was passing. Slowly, but surely. As the 20th century dawned, the world was already shifting rapidly. Cars began to replace horses. Electric lights flickered on in middle-class homes. And factories, now electrified and faster than ever, were producing garments at rates unimaginable a century prior. But for all this modernization, underwear still clung to many of its older forms. At the turn of the century, most people in the industrialized world wore undergarments. But what they wore, and how often they changed it, depended entirely on gender, class, location, and age. Let's begin with the Edwardian era. Around 1900, men were still wearing long drawers, though these were gradually becoming shorter, especially in warmer climates. Wool and heavy cotton remained the primary fabrics, and designs were still conservative, with buttons, ties, and flaps. Women, meanwhile, were swathed in layers. A typical middle-class woman might wear a chemise, a loose underdress, a corset, tightly laced, shaping the waist, split-leg drawers, petticoats, a modest dress or skirt ensemble. It was elaborate, heavy, and thoroughly impractical by modern standards. But winds of change were already blowing. The first major shake-up came with World War I. As men left for the front lines and women entered factories and farms in their place, practicality began to take priority. Women discarded many of their cumbersome layers, including, in many cases, the corset. In its place came the brassiere, initially little more than a light, bust-supporting garment made of cotton or silk, with minimal structure. This shift had enormous consequences. Without corsets to shape their torsos, women began to desire undergarments that offered both support and freedom of movement. For the first time in Western history, women's underwear became functional above all else, and it needed to accommodate walking, lifting, running, and even dancing. On the men's side, the military issued standardized underwear, long johns, undershirts, and socks, which many soldiers brought home with them and incorporated into civilian life. Suddenly, a clean pair of underpants and a fresh undershirt became marks of both health and discipline. Between the wars, in the 1920s and 30s, we witness a remarkable evolution in undergarments. Gone were the layers of the 19th century. In their place came tighter, fitted underpants for men, step-in panties and bras for women, lighter fabrics like rayon and jersey, the beginnings of elastic waistbands. The invention and refinement of elastic would prove transformational. With it, underwear could now stretch, cling, and return to shape, meaning it could be worn more snugly and discreetly. Waistbands no longer needed to be tied or buttoned. It seems small today, but at the time, it was revolutionary. The 1930s also saw the invention of the brief, a form-fitting, Y-front design that offered support and coverage in a smaller package. The Jockey Company popularized this design, and by the 1940s, it was widely adopted by men in the United States and parts of Europe. Then came World War II, which again altered underwear habits. Wartime rationing meant fabric was scarce, and people were encouraged to make do and mend. Many women fashioned bras and panties from flour sacks or old clothing. Underwear was worn until it fell apart, and then patched, sewn, and worn some more. Yet, military uniforms again normalized the concept of daily undergarments. Soldiers and nurses alike were expected to wear fresh underlayers when possible. Clean underwear became associated with cleanliness, discipline, and even patriotism. The post-war boom of the 1950s brought prosperity and consumerism. With it came an explosion of underwear options. Factories churned out millions of garments. Underwear became fashionable, advertised heavily in magazines, catalogs, and eventually on television. Here are a few highlights. Women's panties became shorter, tighter, and made of colorful materials like nylon. Men's briefs and boxers entered a friendly rivalry. Both options were widely available, each with its fans. Undershirts, A-shirts, T-shirts, tank tops became wardrobe staples for men. Girdles and shapewear returned, though now made of latex and rubber instead of whalebone and steel. Interestingly, even during this modern golden age of underwear, some people still went without, especially in rural or impoverished areas, or among counterculture groups. In fact, during the 1960s and 70s, going commando became a small act of rebellion among hippies, naturalists, and artists. The 1960s and 70s were also pivotal for women's liberation. As women protested rigid gender norms, bras were burned, symbolically and literally, and many began choosing simpler or more comfortable options, or none at all. Cotton briefs, athletic bras, or camisoles replaced the lacy or restrictive lingerie of previous decades. Underwear also became more closely linked with identity. Ads no longer just focused on function, they began appealing to sex appeal, status, and personal expression. Brands like Calvin Klein turned undergarments into luxury items, with sleek ads featuring sculpted models in plain white briefs. By the 1980s and 90s, underwear was not just something you wore, it was something you showed. Waistbands were deliberately exposed. Designer brands became status symbols. Thongs and G-strings entered mainstream fashion. Sports bras became acceptable outerwear. Underwear had officially stepped out of the shadows. And yet, even with this shift toward visibility and marketing, the core idea remained: modern underwear was now ubiquitous. No longer just a matter of class or climate, it was expected. Normal. A part of daily hygiene, fashion, and social life. But not everyone participated. In rural areas of India, Africa, and Latin America, many people still wore minimal underlayers, or none at all. Economic inequality, access to laundry, and cultural norms all shaped what people wore beneath their clothes. And even in wealthy nations, some still opted out for comfort, cost, or personal belief. So by the end of the 20th century, underwear had become, paradoxically, both universal and deeply individual. Everyone wore it, but everyone wore it differently. At the dawn of the 2000s, people around the world had more choices than ever before when it came to underwear. Styles ranged from ultra-functional athletic gear to high-fashion lingerie. Materials had evolved beyond cotton and wool, embracing blends like spandex, polyester, bamboo, modal, and microfiber. Every inch of fabric was being reimagined to stretch better, breathe better, wick moisture better, and feel softer. For many, especially in urban and developed settings, underwear was no longer merely practical, it was a lifestyle statement. Let's begin by looking at the evolution of priorities. In the early 2000s, global fashion leaned heavily on branding. Waistbands featuring designer names peeked out from jeans. Pop stars and celebrities wore low-rise pants and high-cut thongs, popularizing a look that left little to the imagination. This era celebrated visibility and body image. Brands like Calvin Klein, Victoria's Secret, Diesel, and La Perla thrived. But underneath the marketing glitz, an undercurrent of personal comfort had begun to grow. As people spent more time in front of screens. Whether for work, leisure, or social media, they also became more aware of how clothes felt during long hours indoors. For many, tight lace, itchy seams, and awkward waistbands became intolerable. Enter the comfort revolution. By the 2010s, minimalism had taken hold. Simple, seamless designs became the norm. Companies like Uniqlo, Hans, Everlane, and later Third Love and Tommy John focused on neutral tones, soft fabrics, and ergonomic shapes. The aim? Underwear you barely noticed. And what about winter? People had more options than ever. Thermal underwear had evolved from scratchy wool into thin, moisture-wicking base layers made from blends of synthetics and natural fibers. Brands like Patagonia, Icebreaker, and Smartwool led the charge with merino wool, a fiber both insulating and breathable. For people in cold climates, this meant they could layer without bulk. A pair of thermal leggings and a long-sleeve base layer became standard winter wear. These layers weren't just about comfort, they became critical survival gear for hikers, campers, and workers exposed to extreme weather. But in homes heated by central vac systems, or in parts of the world with mild winters, many people stopped wearing long underwear altogether. Instead, they relied on heated indoor environments and cozy outer garments like sweatpants, leggings, or thermal pajamas. A strange divide began to appear. In highly industrialized countries, underwear was everywhere, but it was optional indoors. As more people worked from home, especially after the global pandemic in 2020, a curious thing happened: sales of formal clothing dropped, while sales of loungewear and underwear surged. People were spending entire days in their underlayers, whether for Zoom meetings, cleaning the kitchen, or watching movies under a blanket. This casualization of attire blurred the lines between underwear, sleepwear, and daywear. Some even abandoned underwear altogether. This leads us to an unexpected trend: the quiet resurgence of going commando. Not as a rebellious statement, like in the 1960s, but as a simple lifestyle choice. Online forums, wellness influencers, and even doctors began to speak about the health benefits of wearing out, allowing the body to breathe, reducing infections, and avoiding chafing. Some people started wearing looser trousers or dresses with no underwear at all, especially during cold, dry winters where sweat wasn't an issue. Of course, this wasn't for everyone. For those living in drafty homes, sharing space with others, or venturing outside, underwear remained a cozy barrier between body and clothing. But increasingly, people were viewing underwear as optional, chosen for comfort rather than custom. Meanwhile, gender-neutral underwear emerged as a meaningful development in the fashion world. Brands like Tomboy X, MeUndies, and Savage X Fenty released collections designed to be worn by anyone, regardless of gender identity. Underwear was redefined, not as men's or women's, but simply as soft, stretchy, functional layers of fabric. This also opened the door for inclusive sizing, with more brands offering extended ranges that catered to all body types. The conversation shifted from hiding imperfections to embracing individuality. And where did this leave the old ideas of underwear in winter? In many places, they faded quietly. The need to wear multiple underlayers just to survive had been diminished by central heating, insulated buildings, thermal leggings and socks, modern boots and outerwear, and, most of all, fabric technology that kept people warmer with less. But for those who still spent time in unheated spaces, or in homes with drafty windows, layering remained essential. Many opted for fleece-lined underwear, merino wool long johns, or double-knit tights. These weren't the itchy, shapeless garments of the past, they were sleek, light, and engineered. Let's take a peek at the global picture. In Scandinavia, for example, winter underwear includes wool base layers that regulate body heat while avoiding moisture buildup. In Japan, people often wear heat-tech innerwear, developed to retain warmth by capturing body heat through advanced fibers. In rural Mongolia, nomadic herders still rely on sheepskin, camel hair, or felted wool layers, worn close to the skin to endure temperatures that drop far below zero. And in many parts of the developing world, the question of underwear, let alone thermal wear, remains tied to economics. Some communities still share undergarments, wear repurposed fabric, or go without entirely, relying instead on loose outer garments and shared body warmth during long winters. So, in the 21st century, the underwear story is not a single thread, it's a global patchwork quilt. For some, it's bamboo briefs and micromodal thongs. For others, it's woolen base layers under for more layers of clothing. For a few, it's simply nothing at all. In the end, modern people survive winter not because of what's under their clothes, but because of the choices they now have. Central heating, advanced fabrics, cultural freedom, and personal expression allow people to choose what works for their body, their comfort, and their winter. And so, the humble undergarment has finally completed its journey from medieval mystery to mass-market essential, to something even greater, freedom of choice. So far, we've looked at how everyday people, from medieval peasants to modern office workers, have kept warm with, or sometimes without, undergarments. But what happens when cold turns deadly? When temperatures plunge to -40, -60, or even -100 degrees Fahrenheit? What role does underwear play when a person's life depends on staying warm? To answer this, we travel beyond towns and cities into the harshest environments humans have dared to live, work, and explore. Let's begin with a place that many of us only imagine from documentaries: Antarctica. Antarctica, the last frontier of cold. In the desolate expanse of Antarctica, temperatures regularly drop below -70 degrees Celsius in the interior. Here, explorers, scientists, and support personnel must dress with absolute precision. The risk of frostbite and hypothermia is constant. The key to survival? Layering. At the core of every outfit in Antarctica is a set of thermal base layers, what we could call the modern descendants of underwear. But these aren't your average cotton briefs. These layers are made from materials like merino wool, naturally insulating, breathable, and antimicrobial. Synthetic blends, e.g., polypropylene, capylene designed to wick sweat and retain warmth even when wet. Silk, sometimes used for lightweight layering, though less common in modern extreme wear. A base layer typically covers the entire body, leggings and a long-sleeved top, worn directly against the skin. Some even wear thermal briefs or boxers underneath, made of the same advanced fabrics. These layers trap body heat, wick moisture, and prevent the chill from seeping in. Over these, wearers add insulating mid-layers, like fleece, windproof shells, and heavy outer suits. Gloves, goggles, and thermal boots complete the ensemble. In such conditions, going without underwear, even modern thermal undergarments, would be not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. Interestingly, many Antarctic workers sleep in their base layers, blurring the line between underwear and pajamas. These garments must do double duty, maintain warmth and provide comfort during long indoor stretches. Now let's move from Antarctica to an even more surprising place, Mount Everest. Mount Everest, high altitude, low margin for error. Mount Everest stands at over 29,000 feet above sea level. Climbers face not only freezing temperatures but also a lack of oxygen. The body burns energy rapidly, and staying warm becomes a battle against exhaustion. Again, underwear matters. Climbers typically wear 3 to 5 layers, with the base layer often referred to as expedition weight thermal underwear. These are thicker and more insulating than standard thermal wear. Brands like Patagonia, the North Face, and Rab design expedition-grade base layers from merino wool, Polartic fleece, or synthetic thermal blends. These materials regulate temperature while minimizing weight. Every ounce counts at that altitude. Importantly, climbers often wear only one set of base layers for the entire ascent, meaning the material must resist odor, bacteria, and moisture buildup. Merino wool excels here. Some climbers use insulated underwear, shorts or pants filled with synthetic down or Primaloft, worn under or over base layers for additional core warmth. But there's a fascinating twist. On summit day, when speed is essential and the cold is severe, some climbers forego traditional underwear entirely, opting instead for diapers or nothing beneath their full-body down suits. This isn't a fashion decision, it's about reducing bulk and minimizing the number of layers to manage during critical moments. In these scenarios, the idea of underwear becomes secondary to survival. Space travel, underwear in the final frontier. Now, let's step even further, into outer space. You might not expect it, but underwear has a significant role in the world of astronauts and space missions. In space, temperature control is crucial. Although spacecraft and suits are temperature regulated, astronauts still wear specialized base garments under their suits and jumpsuits. These include liquid cooling and ventilation garments, LCVGs worn under spacesuits during extravehicular activity, spacewalks. These outfits circulate water through narrow tubes to regulate body temperature. Compression undergarments, designed to maintain muscle tone in low gravity. Moisture-wicking underwear, to deal with sweat in an environment where evaporation is limited. And yes, astronauts on the International Space Station wear underwear like everyone else, often made of antibacterial fabrics, since doing laundry in space is impossible. The garments must be disposable or stored until returning to Earth. Interestingly, as missions to Mars are considered, researchers are exploring self-cleaning underwear made from advanced fibers that kill bacteria and eliminate odors over long periods. Imagine wearing the same pair of underwear for 30 days, with no discomfort or smell. Arctic expeditions and polar bases. Beyond Everest and Antarctica, we find many more people working in frigid conditions. Scientists at Arctic research stations, military personnel in Siberia, and Inuit hunters in Canada all rely on combinations of wool base layers, insulated undergarments, wind-resistant shells. Among indigenous communities, traditional methods still prevail. Inuit clothing often includes caribou skin underwear, designed for maximum warmth. These garments are breathable, light, and naturally insulating, proving once again that traditional materials still compete with modern tech. Emergency survival: what you wear when you have nothing else. Survival experts often emphasize one rule: never wear cotton in cold weather. Cotton absorbs moisture and loses all insulating properties when wet. In contrast, wool retains warmth even when damp, and synthetics dry quickly. Survival kits sometimes include thermal underwear, space blankets, or multifunctional base garments. In emergencies, having a single high-quality undergarment can mean the difference between life and death. As we've seen, in extreme environments, whether scaling mountains, living in polar outposts, or floating in orbit, underwear becomes not just optional comfort but a critical survival tool. These garments must trap heat, wick moisture, allow freedom of movement, resist bacteria, stay effective for days or weeks without washing. And yet, even in these extreme cases, the modern evolution of underwear blurs traditional boundaries. What we call underwear is often outerwear. What used to be private is now engineered for performance. It's clear that humanity has taken a simple garment, once made from rough linen or wool, and turned it into a high-tech, life-saving layer that can withstand the coldest winds, the tallest peaks, and the vacuum of space. Up to this point, we've talked a lot about the function of underwear in the winter. But humans, as social creatures, have always placed more than just practical value on what we wear underneath our clothes, especially when it comes to modesty, cleanliness, purity, and even luck. So what happens when people, by choice or necessity, go without underwear in cold climates? How have different societies viewed this act? Let's step quietly into this world of beliefs, taboos, and meanings wrapped around that one very private layer. In many cultures, particularly those influenced by religious or traditional codes of modesty, underwear is not just about warmth, it's about propriety. In medieval Europe, it was often believed that exposing the bare skin to cold air, especially around the lower body, was morally questionable and even spiritually risky. A person without undergarments was sometimes seen as vulnerable not only to illness but to sin. For example, in 17th-century England, Puritan ideals linked nakedness with shame and moral weakness. While the wealthy had access to warm, layered undergarments, the poor were sometimes judged for lacking them, not only because they were cold, but because they were improperly dressed. In Orthodox Christian traditions, certain rituals, like entering a sacred space, required full cleanliness and modest coverage. Underwear was, in this sense, a spiritual buffer between the body and the divine. Ironically, this emphasis on covering the body sometimes caused greater health risks, as people avoided changing or airing out garments for fear of being seen in a shameful state. In cold winters, some women slept fully clothed in corsets, petticoats, and layers of underclothes, believing that being seen in a nightgown, or less, was worse than falling ill from the damp. Naked truths in the Nordic world. In contrast to these ideas, Scandinavian and Arctic communities developed a much more relaxed relationship with nudity and warmth. Among the Sami of northern Finland and Norway, for example, traditional dress emphasized function over modesty. Woolen or fur-lined trousers and tunics were layered over the body without concern for conventional underwear. What mattered was survival, not social decorum. Going without undergarments was common, especially when living in tightly packed, insulated homes where temperatures indoors were warm. Even today, the cultural tradition of saunas in Finland and Russia illustrates this relaxed attitude. People strip down entirely, even in the dead of winter, and then roll in the snow or jump into icy lakes before returning to the heat. Here, nudity isn't taboo, it's part of life. Warmth comes not from layers of cloth, but from the rituals themselves, passed down for centuries. Magical underwear, superstition and symbolism. In many places, undergarments have also been linked to luck, fertility, and protection, especially in cold climates where illness and death lurked around every frosty corner. Let's visit a few curious beliefs. Eastern Europe, in parts of Ukraine and Poland, it was once believed that wearing red undergarments in winter could protect against evil spirits and bring good fortune. Red, being the color of blood and warmth, symbolized life itself. Italy and Spain, a similar belief persists today, where wearing red underwear on New Year's Eve is thought to bring luck and love in the coming year. Though not limited to cold weather, the symbolism is heightened in winter, when vitality and connection are most sought. Russia, in rural traditions, it was believed that a woman could protect her household from the bitter cold by placing a piece of her underwear under the doorstep, a ritual blending fertility, warmth, and protection against harsh weather. China. In colder regions of ancient China, some garments served spiritual purposes as much as physical ones. Children often wore belly warmers, dudu, thought to shield not only their vital organs but also their life force, or qi. These rituals and superstitions suggest that underwear, even when unseen, carried powerful meaning, especially during times of cold and hardship. Public shame and the fear of exposure. We might think of modern society as more relaxed, but the fear of being seen without underwear, especially in cold weather, has long been associated with public embarrassment or shame. Let's travel back to Victorian England for a moment. In that era, modesty was paramount. Underclothes included multiple layers, chemises, drawers, crinolines, corsets, and even the most mundane garments were designed to avoid accidental exposure. To go without proper underwear in the cold wasn't simply unpleasant, it was considered scandalous. If a woman were caught without drawers beneath her skirts, it could damage her social reputation. Yet ironically, many working-class women did just that, simply because they couldn't afford enough garments. This quiet divide between what was proper and what was possible created a long-standing cultural tension. And for men? It was no better. The British Navy, for instance, had regulations requiring all sailors to wear drawers in cold climates, not just for warmth, but for discipline and uniformity. A man caught without his drawers might be punished for indecency or sloppiness. Rituals of warmth, underwear, and sleep in cold seasons. In colder cultures, sleep was often treated as a time of vulnerability. Many families believed that the body was spiritually unguarded during sleep, especially in winter when the barrier between life and death felt thin. As a result, sleepwear and underwear blurred together. Nightshirts, long johns, or even day undergarments were worn under the covers, not just for comfort but as symbolic protection. Some traditions even included blessing undergarments for children in winter to ensure they'd stay warm, safe, and free from the reach of spirits or illness in the night. In Icelandic folklore, there are tales of laundry elves who punished those who wore unwashed undergarments too long, or those who didn't treat their underclothes with respect. Whether meant to encourage hygiene or humility, these stories underscore the emotional power of something so seemingly mundane. The battlefield has always been a place of hardship. But few conditions tested the limits of the human body quite like winter warfare. Imagine sleeping on frozen ground, marching through snow in threadbare boots, and waking to frozen rations, with no proper underwear to guard your skin from the cutting cold. For soldiers throughout history, undergarments weren't just forgotten luxuries. They were often non-existent. The question wasn't whether you had clean underwear, but whether you had anything dry at all to wrap around your shivering body. The ancient soldier, bare basics on frozen ground. Let's begin with the Roman legions. These soldiers marched thousands of miles through snow, rain, and mud. While Roman armor was advanced for its time, it did little to protect against the cold. Roman soldiers typically wore a linen tunic, sometimes woolen if they were lucky, and a cloak called a sagum for warmth. But undergarments? Rarely. Most legionaries didn't wear any underpants at all. Instead, they wrapped strips of cloth, subligacular, around their waists, resembling a loincloth more than proper drawers. In cold campaigns across Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, the Romans improvised. They sometimes wore animal hides beneath their tunics or stuffed wool between layers for insulation. But without true underwear, they faced brutal winters with numb limbs and chattering teeth. A soldier's only defense against the cold was his discipline and grit, and the hope that marching would keep the blood flowing. The medieval knight, layers of armor, but none beneath. Fast forward to the medieval period. You might imagine knights protected by heavy plate armor were safe from the cold. But beneath all that steel lay a surprising truth: many wore only a linen shirt and hose under their chainmail or armor, and no underpants at all. The reason? Armor was designed for mobility and needed to be worn close to the body. Bulky undergarments would have restricted movement or caused chafing. So instead, they wore padded garments like the gambeson, but not necessarily anything underneath it. Imagine camping in a snow-covered field during the 100 Years' War. Your gambeson is soaked with sweat from the battle earlier. Night falls. The cold sets in. And there's no dry underwear to change into. No fire hot enough to dry your garments. And no bed. Only the ground and a horse blanket for warmth. Napoleon's nightmare, the Russian winter. Perhaps the most infamous winter campaign in history was Napoleon's disastrous march into Russia in 1812. His Grande Army set out in summer, expecting a quick victory. But by the time winter arrived, his troops were woefully underprepared. Soldiers lacked warm coats, waterproof boots, and certainly had no clean undergarments. What little they had was quickly soaked, frozen, or lost. Eyewitness accounts describe soldiers stuffing newspaper, hay, or rags into their clothing, or stripping garments from the dead to try to stay warm. Some wore 3 or 4 pairs of trousers just to preserve body heat, but underneath, they were often bare-skinned, as underwear was never issued as standard gear. Frostbite took fingers, toes, and lives. The biting cold froze urine in canteens and turned exhaled breath into ice on beards. And without dry undergarments, soldiers suffered chafing, blisters, and infections, compounded by weeks without bathing. Trench realities, World War I and the cold below. By the time of World War I, armies had learned some lessons about cold. Soldiers were issued woolen long underwear, at least in theory. In practice, shortages were common. The trenches of the Western Front were damp, muddy, and bitterly cold in winter. Soldiers sat in frozen ditches for hours or days. Even if you had underwear, it would quickly become wet and useless. Many units rotated only a single set of underwear among a group of soldiers. When it came your turn to wear the long johns, they were already soaked with someone else's sweat and filth. Lice-infested seams. Frostbite chewed through extremities. And if you soiled your underclothes? Too bad. Laundry was often impossible. Some soldiers tried to improvise by wearing sacks, scarves, or even stolen women's bloomers as makeshift underwear. Others lined their uniforms with newspaper or straw. But most simply endured, teeth clenched, hands frozen, hearts numb. World War II and the commando problem. During World War II, undergarment supply had improved, but not equally across all forces. In particularly cold theaters, like the Ardennes, the Russian front, or the Italian mountains, many soldiers found themselves again without proper underwear. In elite units like the British Commandos or American paratroopers, speed and agility were prioritized over comfort. Soldiers often went commando, a term derived from these troops, meaning without underwear. But going without underpants in freezing weather brought serious risks. Rashes, open sores, and bladder infections became common. Soldiers developed immersion foot, a condition where the feet begin to rot from prolonged dampness and cold. Ironically, the commando image was associated with bravery and boldness. But in practice, it often meant shivering through long nights, your trousers rubbing raw against bare skin as you dreamed of dry wool and a hot stove. Recycling, sharing, and desperation. When underwear was available in wartime, it was precious. Soldiers often reused the same pair for weeks, drying it over campfires or hanging it inside helmets. Some swapped garments with friends to get a fresher pair, less from hygiene, more from sheer psychological relief. Field hospitals sometimes issued long johns to wounded soldiers as a reward for surviving battle. There are stories from Korea and Vietnam of troops treasuring a pair of clean underpants more than food. Even in the Gulf War and beyond, stories of frozen nights in desert mountains show that cold remains a soldier's silent enemy. And no matter how modern the army, when winter bites, even the strongest miss that thin, warm barrier of cloth. The quiet toll. The absence of underwear during winter warfare wasn't just about discomfort. It was about dignity. About identity. For many soldiers, losing their undergarments was the final straw, a reminder of how stripped and exposed they were, physically and mentally. One soldier from Napoleon's army wrote, "I had lost my boots, my coat, my honor, but it was the cold between my thighs that broke me. I could no longer pretend to be a man." Such words show us that beneath every war story, beneath the armor, medals, and legends, there is a human being, often freezing. When we think of surviving without underwear in the winter, it's often adults, laborious, soldiers, or peasants who come to mind. But the true test of endurance was felt not by the strong, but by the vulnerable. In ancient and medieval times, children, the elderly, the sick, and pregnant women were often the ones most at risk. Their bodies were fragile. Their resistance to cold weaker. And yet, in most cultures, they were given no special clothing, no cozy underpants, no thick woolen leggings. Instead, they endured like everyone else, wrapped in whatever scraps could be spared. Children in the cold. Let us begin with children. In many early societies, from rural Europe to tribal Africa, infants and toddlers were not dressed as miniature adults. Instead, they were often swaddled tightly in cloths or rags, sometimes padded with hay or wool if available. But underwear was unheard of. A baby might be wrapped in a single long cloth, wound around the body several times, designed to both hold in warmth and keep limbs stiff and still. Underneath? Bare skin. Toddlers wore simple tunics or smocks, often nothing underneath. If the family had extra wool, they might line the inside of the tunic for added warmth. But underwear, especially in cold months, was a luxury few children ever experienced. Mothers got creative. Some stuffed moss or lamb's wool into the folds of clothing, while others sewed hidden layers of dried grass into garments. Some reused cut-up flour sacks as makeshift liners. And in regions where sheep or goats were common, sheepskin was the miracle fabric, soft on the inside, water-repellent on the outside. Still, many children fell ill from exposure. Colds became coughs. Coughs became fevers. And fevers in the 13th century could be fatal. Grandparents and the cold ache of age. For the elderly, life without underwear in winter was a daily ache. Arthritic joints screamed in the morning frost. Thin skin split open in the cold air. Yet undergarments were often seen as a youthful luxury, and certainly not something the aged would prioritize. In many peasant households, older family members wore layered robes or multiple tunics, but rarely anything beneath them. They might have a linen chemise or a nightgown for bed, but these garments weren't considered underwear in the modern sense. Just layers. In some communities, old women would pad their skirts with bundles of straw or felt, tied with belts under their garments to keep their hips and bellies warm. Men sometimes wrapped woolen scarves around their groins or used folded cloth to protect against the chill, but these were homemade, makeshift items. In cold, mountainous regions like the Scottish Highlands or the Carpathians, families sewed handmade quilted underskirts for grandmothers or fur-lined breeches for grandfathers, stitched from scraps or discarded cloaks. These items were passed down like treasures, mended year after year. The sick and the weak. For the ill, being warm was a matter of survival. Without central heating, the sick were laid beside the hearth or wrapped in furs and blankets. If they had no underwear to wick away sweat or keep in warmth, their tunics and nightshirts became damp with fever and breath, clinging to their cold skin and worsening their condition. Monastic infirmaries sometimes gave their patients woolen undertunics if available. But outside abbeys and noble houses, care fell to family. Mothers made soft undercloths from old sheets, cutting them into rectangles and fastening them with pins or string. Some families made makeshift underpants from linen rags soaked in lard or goose fat, meant to create a warming barrier and reduce chafing from sweat. When someone was bedridden, they were often stripped of everything but one outer garment. This was less about modesty and more about scarcity. There just weren't enough clothes to waste on layers no one would see. Pregnant women and winter. Pregnancy was always precarious, but even more so in the cold. With no maternity clothing, women wore their same dresses and shifts, often cinched higher to accommodate a growing belly. But the absence of undergarments meant constant exposure to dampness, drafts, and risk of infection. Midwives advised women to wrap their bellies in warm cloth, often linen soaked in herbal oils or sheep fat, to keep muscles soft and shield the womb. These belly bands sometimes extended between the thighs, acting as makeshift supportive underwear. Post-birth, women were sometimes given soft woolen cloths to place between their legs to absorb blood and warmth. But often, they relied on grass, straw, or moss, natural but not always clean. Communal warmth, the bed as an underwear substitute. In winter, families used every strategy they could to survive. And when underwear wasn't an option, shared warmth was the next best thing. Multiple generations often slept in a single bed. Children, parents, grandparents, even distant cousins, huddled beneath blankets and furs, pressed together for warmth. A baby might be wrapped against a mother's chest. A grandfather's legs might serve as a foot warmer for his grandson. Sometimes, warmth came not from clothing, but from body heat. Clothes were dried overnight by the fire, and each morning brought the same cold dance, pulling stiff, frozen tunics over naked skin, wincing, groaning, and starting the day once more. The undergarment that wasn't. One of the most fascinating practices in some regions was the creation of permanent underwear, layers of wool or felt sewn directly into outer garments, meant never to be removed during winter. In Scandinavian villages, for example, it was common to wear sheepskin-lined trousers or skirts that had no inner lining at all. The skin side went directly against the body. When they got dirty or wet, people dried them by the fire, but rarely washed them. In Eastern European villages, linen wraps were tied around thighs and hips, then layered with skirts or robes. These wraps served as a substitute for underwear, but were often sewn into the garments themselves, making daily changing impossible. Love and wool. Despite all this hardship, one thing becomes clear: families found ways to care for each other. A grandmother might knit a pair of woolen thigh wraps for her granddaughter. A father might give his only dry tunic to his feverish son. A mother might sleep on the outer edge of the bed, taking the brunt of the cold wind from the cracked door. Without underwear, survival in winter depended not just on cleverness, but on love, closeness, and sacrifice. As you drift now, slowly into the hush of your own warm evening, remember those who lay huddled together centuries ago. In silence. In simplicity. And sometimes, with nothing but a blanket of straw and each other's arms to keep the frost away. As we near the end of our journey through winter's historical trials, let us shift our attention away from the humble homes and frost-bitten fields and instead turn our gaze toward the quieter sanctuaries of privilege and devotion. Here, nestled in stone manors and tucked within monastic walls, we discover an entirely different relationship with the cold, one marked not necessarily by ease, but by distinctly different strategies, philosophies, and resources for enduring winter's grip without the comfort of modern undergarments. Imagine, if you will, the long echoing halls of a medieval castle. Thick walls of limestone and granite hold out the wind but also trap a deep, persistent chill. The wealthy inhabitants of these stone fortresses did not escape the cold altogether, but they certainly endured it differently. Layers remained their greatest weapon, but the materials at their disposal were far superior. Rather than coarse wool or rough flax, the wealthy had access to fine linens, soft silks, and above all, fur, that prized and often ostentatious barrier between skin and shiver. Fur was more than fashion, it was a winter essential, and it often took the place of underwear entirely. Robes lined with ermine, cloaks hemmed in squirrel, or even undertunics trimmed with marten or fox provided an insulating barrier for those who could afford such luxury. It was not uncommon for noblemen and women to wear nothing beneath a fur-lined tunic but a fine linen chemise, thin and breathable, yet warmed by the insulating pelt pressed close by heavy outer garments. In some noble households, fur undergarments even became a sign of decadent status, garments never seen publicly but privately admired. In inventories of the elite, we sometimes find mention of fur-lined drawers or sleeves of rabbit fur intended to be worn against the skin. These were rare, of course, and often reserved for royalty or clergy of high rank, but they remind us that the line between innerwear and outerwear was fluid and dictated more by class than custom. Meanwhile, within the quiet cloisters of monasteries and convents, another form of insulation unfolded, one based less on luxury and more on discipline, routine, and spiritual comfort. Monks and nuns, like the peasants in the village beyond their walls, usually had little in the way of elaborate undergarments. Simplicity and humility were the rule. Yet the rhythm of monastic life brought its own protection from the cold. Here, garments were layered for modesty and warmth. A monk might wear a long, homespun tunic over a woolen shirt and drawstring trousers, with a thick scapula, a sleeveless overrobe, draped over it all. Though not undergarments in the modern sense, these layers functioned similarly, trapping warmth and preventing direct exposure to the biting air. More important than their clothing, however, was the structured lifestyle of those in religious orders. Regular hours for prayer, physical labor, and communal meals kept bodies moving and maintained internal warmth. Stone monasteries were cold, but often better built than village cottages. Some even had enclosed cloisters that offered shelter from the worst weather, and communal halls where fires could be tended. And then there was the matter of faith. For many within monastic walls, enduring the chill of winter was seen not merely as discomfort but as penance, a means to test the soul and strengthen the spirit. To shiver was to share in Christ's suffering. To feel the frost was to be reminded of one's mortality and need for divine grace. In this way, what others may have called misery, some cloistered souls embraced as devotion. Back among the nobility, comfort and faith also intertwined. Wealthy households often employed chaplains or kept private chapels, where prayers for health and protection against illness, especially in the chill of winter, were routinely offered. Charitable acts such as distributing clothing or firewood to the poor during colder months were believed to safeguard one's soul and demonstrate stewardship of wealth. Curiously, some noble families would take pilgrimages during winter, seeking healing at shrines or warmer climates, their travels made possible by horse-drawn litters lined in furs and robes. The very ability to flee the cold, or to bring comfort with them, was yet another sign of privilege in an age when most people could not travel far from their homes. Even within palaces and castles, however, warmth was not guaranteed. Fires, though abundant, were localized. A hearth might blaze in a great hall or private chamber, but the cold pressed in through windows, through gaps in floors, and up from the stone foundations. Bedchambers remained chilly despite draped canopies and tapestries, and so even the richest men and women huddled under thick piles of wool, fur, and feather-stuffed mattresses. As for children of the noble class, they were often swaddled in finely woven wool and linen from head to toe, and in colder climates, sometimes placed in rooms near kitchens or hearths for warmth. Nursemaids, likewise, were bundled alongside their charges, and caretakers remained awake through the night to ensure fires did not go out. Servants within these grand homes also experienced a different relationship to the cold. Though technically part of the household elite by proximity, their accommodations were rarely warmed, and their clothing, though functional, was not often lavish. Many wore simple wool undergarments or padded hose, and often layered spare cloth or rags for extra insulation. Those who worked near the hearth, cooks, bakers, or blacksmiths, fared best in winter, while chambermaids and stable boys bore the brunt of cold in quieter corners of the estate. And yet, even in the grandeur of privilege, the body was still subject to the elements. Illnesses that arrived with the cold, chills, pneumonia, rheumatism, did not spare the rich entirely. Though their recovery chances were greater, thanks to warm food, softer beds, and attentive care, they were never truly immune to winter's bite. So we see that even among the elite and the devout, the question of surviving without modern underwear in winter did not have one clear answer. The rich had the advantage of materials, silks, furs, tailored layers, and the poor had the advantage of movement and adaptation. The religious had faith, ritual, and shared discipline. But all, regardless of class, contended with a season that arrived year after year, without mercy, and demanded creativity, resilience, and endurance in return. As we prepare for our final segment, we will gently step back from the intimate corners of medieval life and look more broadly at what we've discovered about how people not only survived winter's cold, but how they grew, innovated, and found meaning in the struggle. And so, as we reach the final chapter of this long and meandering journey through centuries of cold winters and bare skin, let us step back and warm our hands by the metaphorical hearth. The path has taken us from mud-floor cottages and frozen riverbanks to castle chambers, monastic cells, and everything in between, all to answer a deceptively simple question: how did people survive without underwear in winter? The truth, as we've seen, is not found in a single explanation, but rather in the layers, both literal and symbolic, of human adaptation, cultural variation, and endurance. Surviving without modern undergarments wasn't merely a matter of clothing. It was a matter of material culture, climate, economy, religion, and daily rhythm. The absence of elastic waistbands and thermal blends was not a tragedy, it was simply a fact of life, one met with innovation and stoicism in equal measure. Consider again the peasant farmer rising before dawn to feed his animals, his body wrapped in wool and linen, no modern insulation to speak of, only breath visible in the air and a strong sense of duty driving him forward. He did not possess long johns or synthetic base layers, but he knew how to wrap his legs in cloth, how to layer garments for warmth, how to work hard enough that the blood flowed to his fingers and toes. The cold was not his enemy, but his environment, one he met with familiar tools. And what of the women washing clothes in freezing water, sleeves rolled high, bare legs numbed by the river's edge? Their resilience did not come from technical gear, but from habit, necessity, and shared knowledge passed between generations. They padded their skirts, wore 2 shifts, or bound cloth around the legs and hips. What couldn't be warmed externally was endured internally, through movement, routine, and companionship. Children, too, grew up in these conditions with far fewer protections than modern standards would allow. They played, learned, and worked through winters wrapped in hand-me-downs, knitted hose, and rough cloaks. Their resilience was forged early, shaped by close quarters and shared blankets, by firesides filled with stories and songs. Cold was part of their world, not an aberration. In the towns and growing cities of later centuries, people adapted in other ways. They clustered in tighter neighborhoods for warmth, invented clever garments like quilted petticoats and woolen hose, and found community in shared rituals. From winter markets to church gatherings, all designed to draw people together during the year's darkest months. The wealthier classes, as we've seen, had more choices. Fur, tailored clothing, and access to heated rooms gave them options, but even so, they were not untouched by the chill. Their lives were cushioned, but not sealed off. The night air still crept through windows, bedchambers still required multiple blankets. Their servants still relied on old methods, and when a fireplace wasn't nearby, the rich often relied on thick robes or warming stones, humble tools in gilded surroundings. Meanwhile, in monasteries and religious institutions, where simplicity and modesty prevailed, warmth was found in discipline and shared suffering. Here, the absence of undergarments was less about poverty and more about principle, a conscious rejection of bodily comfort in favor of spiritual endurance. They may have been cold, but they were never alone in their discomfort. And in all these settings, we find common threads: the power of community, the ingenuity of layering, the importance of movement, and the slow but steady pace of innovation. From binding cloth to quilting layers, from hanging tapestries to designing doublets, each small step marked humanity's desire not just to survive the cold, but to understand it, prepare for it, and ultimately endure it with grace. It is easy to forget how recently our modern comforts emerged. Central heating, electric blankets, thermal underwear, all are barely a century old. For most of human history, warmth was earned through effort, proximity, and persistence. Our ancestors did not wait for comfort, they created it through what they had. So when we ask, how did people survive without underwear in winter, we are really asking, how did people live with the cold, before the age of convenience? And the answer lies not just in clothing but in culture. In shared meals beside the hearth, in thick curtains drawn tight, in laughter echoing in stone halls, and in the stoic determination of generations who met the chill head-on. They survived through wisdom passed down in silence, in fabric scraps and fire rituals, in dances on cold floors and hot stew shared from a single pot. They survived because they had to, and because, in the end, survival in winter was never just about what touched the skin. It was about the human spirit, that deeply rooted flame that keeps burning, even in the frostiest of nights. Now, as we close this long and cozy exploration, let the final image linger in your mind: a quiet room, dimly lit, the fire crackling low. Outside, snow falls softly. Inside, a family, or perhaps a monk, a servant, or a merchant, pulls the blanket close, says a short prayer, and settles into the night. No modern heat. No elastic waistbands. Just wool, straw, faith, and the silent resolve that, come morning, life will go on. Rest now, knowing you've walked centuries in their threadbare shoes. May the quiet endurance of the past warm you, even if only in imagination.